Welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show appearing only here on Facebook Live and the only place where Shaka answers your questions. I'm Peter Clottey. Paul Indio is away on assignment, and here with me is Shaka Sally himself. Hi Shaka, how are you doing?
I am hugely terrific, Peter. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you on Shaka Extra Time for the first time.
Thank you, Shaka.
You're most welcome.
Well, Shaka, next week, Sierra Leoneans go to the polls having a runoff election. Next Tuesday, to be specific. Well, what are your views?
Next week, they go to a presidential runoff, barring unforeseeable circumstances.
Right.
And if they do, you probably know better after all. You spent there about 10 days, correct?
I did, Shaka.
How was it like?
It was interesting, particularly when a lot of people were harboring fear that there could be violence because of the civil war they experienced, and they believed that Enesbaya Koroma, who had served his two 5 full year terms, was playing too much of a role in the March 7 elections when he should play like a father figure and allow the presidential candidate to battle it out. But it was interesting how some of the slogans they were using were quite fascinating.
Well, it looks like if indeed the presidential runoff takes place, it clearly looks like the opposition candidate seem to have a huge advantage.
Yes, they do.
It could be very well, be that we're going to be seeing a new president from a new party. After all, more than 10 years ago, we had another president, Ahmed Tejan Kabar, representing the same political party that, in fact, brigadier or brigadier general, whichever you want to look at it, whether it is the international standard, the brigadier general, but the British say Brigadier Julius Maad Bio, could actually be a new kid on the block. And if he does, it will be very interesting for me especially, because guess what? I used to interview him so many years ago when he was actually attending university at American College right here in Washington, D.C., and living in nearby Virginia in Arlington.
You know, Shaka, the interesting thing too is that Brigadier Julius Maad is in talks with some of these opposition figures to try to get their endorsement ahead of next Tuesday's election. Of course, if Ibrahim Soare Koroma, who had just filed an injunction at the Supreme Court seeking the court to place an injunction on the runoff vote, if that comes to pass. But Alhaji Musa Tarawali, the presidential candidate for one of the opposition parties, endorsed him, because they said, I don't see why we shouldn't endorse him because we all run on chain. So why not? But
is that a very significant endorsement? Because let's face it, what kind of percentage does he in fact bring on the table?
Well, that's interesting because he got about 1%.
About 1%.
About 1%. But then, the second round or the presidential runoff vote, it's a simple majority other than the first 55% threshold required to constitutionally win the first round of the presidential election. So it's very interesting.
And what about the mood, in fact, when you think about it? You probably know, about that better than I or anybody else because you were right there again. When you look at the mood, are people really talking about change or more of the same?
The overwhelming message was change. When you go in the streets, people were really talking about change. You talk to people who are hawking on the street, they say Tolombo means no curve, no bend. They are going straight with the ruling party. However, those who seem to be so-called elite intellectuals are going for change because they think the country is going in a wrong direction. They think there's too much corruption, although they admit that the president, Enesbaya Koroma, who is outgoing, has really done a good work with infrastructural development, road construction and all that. They think that the rampant corruption is too much and that some of his ministers were so arrogant and will not listen to any pieces of advice that anybody gives them, and that they even accuse the international community of holding the Electoral Commission hostage to force a regime change. All these accusations keep going around.
But what about the fact that, you know, Ernest Bai Koroma is a good man. You know that I've had the opportunity to interact with him on, you know, a few occasions. But let's face it, he doesn't seem to have quite a good record, really. Perhaps because of the circumstances, especially when you look at the Ebola virus and all that kind of stuff. It was a very, very big, I think, a very difficult, really, moment for him. And then when you look at the iron ore prices and all kind of stuff, and the economy, frankly, tanking. And they have all these diamonds in Kono and what have you. I don't know, come on. You probably need a new person who is probably a little bit more innovative, more creative, or more imaginative to turn the thing around. But let's face it, this is also good, really, for democracy. And especially for the West African region, for ECOWAS, really, when you think about it. We just came out of another election, was it in January in Liberia, where we have a new president, you know, former international soccer star, George Weah, a man who pretty much, you know, won hands down. And there was a peaceful transition of power from Madam President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf to George Weah, which is very good for democracy, for Liberia, and for Africa, really. And there is also a possibility that you probably actually are going to experience another type of peaceful transition of power from one individual, Ernest Bai Koroma, to someone else.
Well, this brings to quickly in mind one of the questions one of the audience asked, Augustine Tamba from Monrovia, Liberia, who asked, can President George Weah find courage and will to fight corruption, nepotism, bad governance in Liberia?
Yes, indeed. I think, of course, his work is cut out for him. Let's face it. Madam Sirleaf didn't seem to really do a very good job about corruption. But then again, you can't blame her probably too much because, let's face it, this is the first time that Liberia is experiencing a democratic, peaceful transition from one president to another since 1945. And so, frankly, you really have to say that George Weah, yes, is a very good man. He means very well. He's very exposed. There are people that think that he probably isn't really very exposed politically because obviously he served, I think, in the Senate for almost about 3 years or something of that sort. But it depends on what kind of team he surrounds with himself and to what extent he listens to them and he consults and all that kind of stuff.
Another question in conjunction with what I asked earlier, I said, we have Liberia Ambassador Eric Palop Collins who asked, how can President George Weah tackle economic recovery, particularly in that country, Liberia?
Again, like I said, he will need to be very, very innovative, very imaginative, very creative. He has to do things a little bit differently. And he has to be in a position where he can attract really, I would say, investment from outside. I think luckily he's the type of person who could probably do that because he spent many years, of course, on top of the soccer world, you know, in Europe and all that kind of stuff. And so he made some friends and what have you. And it's quite possible that there are business people who may simply want to go and invest in Liberia simply because they can, in fact, get a chance to breathe the same air with George Weah.
The president?
Yes.
You know, when he was being inaugurated, you have all kinds of his friends, the former soccer players he played with, all of them going there.
And
some
managers.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And some are thinking that, you know, with the help that he could possibly get, there will be new investments in Liberia, possibly.
It's quite possible. I mean, but, you know, again, his work is really cut out for him, and he will need a lot of players, and people will have to be a little bit patient for him, in fact, to deliver, because it will take some time, but let's face it, I think we should give him the benefit of the doubt.
Going back to Sierra Leone, the issue of the Ebola crisis that happened, the issue of the mudslide which killed over 600 people. Local estimates said over 2,000 people were affected. However, government figures says about 650. People have been asking where the monies went. The international community gave a lot of money during the Ebola crisis, during the mudslide. Huge sums of money, millions of dollars were put in the country. The government has given varying degrees of explanation, yet people are unsatisfied. They keep demanding. At least most of the presidential candidates in the first round asked where those monies went. Do you think those could affect what might come possibly next Tuesday if the court allows the election to continue?
You just told me that you basically experienced and saw the mood, you know, that people in fact want change. Why do they want change? Obviously, they probably want change simply because they don't particularly like the current conditions that they live in. So I think that all those factors really will come to bear, especially when they begin looking at a candidate of an incumbent government as someone who is an agent of what some would characterize as a merchant of corruption and impunity. They want something else. That's the beauty of democracy. Choice.
You know, when we spoke with the chairman of the Electoral Commission in Sierra Leone, he was so confident. He said, don't worry about issues of rigging and all that, because we have put in measures to prevent those. Any constituency that votes over 100%, we just demand a recount or we cancel it outright.
Precisely.
You know, and he followed suit. Some people were displeased, and he seemed to look at a bigger picture than what is in Sierra Leone. He wants Sierra Leone to be a beacon, you know, an example to people around the world, not only in Africa, to say they did something right by embracing the tenet of democracy in Sierra Leone. What are your thoughts?
It's quite possible that he's on the right track. After all, he follows into the footsteps of someone who used to be in charge of the Electoral Commission in Sierra Leone, who actually happened to be female. She was a lady, and I think at one time she was probably Minister of Education or something of that
Christian
sort.
Thorpe.
That is correct. And you remember exactly what she did. She's the one, in fact, who conducted the election that brought incumbent President Ernest Bai Koroma in office. And so, look, this particular guy is in good company. There is a precedent already that, at least in the past, you had an Electoral Commission chairperson who was independent, who was fair, who was just, who was professional.
You know, one of the things that came to light while in Sierra Leone was that for the first time, you had several former heads of state across Africa coming there, leading several delegations to monitor the elections. You had former Ghanaian President John Dramani Mahama, former South African President Kgalema Motlanthe, you know, and other world leaders were all there having discussions with not only President Ernest Bai Koroma, who is outgoing, but some officials of the Electoral Commission, and they deployed all across the country.
Yes, and especially when you talk about former Ghanaian President John Dramani Mahama, who not a long time ago himself found himself running for the second term and actually falling short, but coming out openly with courage and confidence to essentially concede defeat with grace. And then you talk about Kgalema Motlanthe, a former, of course, interim president of sorts in South Africa. The one was a stopgap between the presidents of Thabo Mbeki and, of course, eventually that of your friend Musholozi, Jacob Zuma, who apparently happens now to be former South African president. Jacob Zuma, simply because there is democracy that works in South Africa, he was pretty much recalled by the ANC ruling party, just like the same man, you know, he helped to recall back in 2008, Thabo Mbeki. That means democracy is working in some parts of Africa, which is a very good thing, because South Africa, it's not only a country, it just happens to be perhaps the most industrialized country on the African continent. It used to be the leading economy. The last time I checked, it now seems to be third after Nigeria and Egypt. Hopefully, a man like Cyril Ramaphosa, who happens to be a very successful businessman himself, may probably turn things around so that South Africa probably becomes very prominent economically again. But the fact that South Africa can actually embrace democracy is a very beautiful thing for Africa, just like the beautiful game, football, which almost no one actually dislikes. Because South Africa can actually act as a legitimate beacon of hope for African democracy. It is big in the economy. It is big in the population. I think they are now, the last time I checked, between 50 and probably 70,000 million people, so to speak. So that is very beautiful. And if Nigeria, for example, continues to embrace democracy like it did in 2015, you're talking about the most populous nation on the African continent, that would also be a beacon of hope for West Africa. And certainly what you need now is something in East Africa. You could probably have Kenya or Tanzania. Even more interestingly, if in fact Ethiopia could become democratic, not the type of democracy that the Obama administration, characterized as 100% democracy, frankly, where there's not even a single member of parliament representing the opposition in two houses, two chambers of parliament in Ethiopia. Essentially, every seat there is controlled by the ruling EPRDF, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic, they say, Front. Can you believe it?
Interesting. Talking about democracy on the continent, we have Wise, who asked that he was so worried about many African countries in crisis, particularly DRC. Are the December presidential elections really going to take place this time, looking at the track record of President Kabila?
Well, I think that, again, we have to give him the benefit of the doubt. And this time, of course, there is tremendous pressure from inside the Catholic Church, for example. And the Catholic Church is very important because I remember telling you that one day a former French president, Jacques Chirac, he warned the then Zimbabwean president, Robert Gabriel Mugabe. He said, there are two things, if you want to stay in power, that you have to be careful to alienate. One is the Catholic Church, whose symbol, of course, is the Vatican, the only aspect that symbolizes what was once the mighty Roman Empire.
Right.
And then, of course, the media. And so the Catholic Church seems to be leading a charge for change or for democracy in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then you have some of the regional players and the international community. You're talking about the United Nations itself, Security Council. You're talking about the United States of America. They're bringing pressure to bear so that they can actually hold elections. When you think about Joseph Kabila, he was supposed, in fact, to have left office in December 2016. The last time I checked, this is 2 years later. Do you really think that he can pull off anything very tricky this time around? It's increasingly beginning looking like very, very difficult. The question is, if in fact they are going to have an election, is it in fact going to be an election? Or is it going to be a selection?
Interesting. In the neighborhood, you have President Pierre Nkurunziza, who has announced that in May they will have a referendum to attempt to change the constitution to run again, following similar patterns in the East African region, with some of these leaders changing the constitution or amending it to seek additional terms in office.
And they will do it. And of course, when you talk about Pierre Nkurunziza, is one of the neighbors of the DRC. And then the other one is also Rwanda. Kagame has already done that. He has it in the bag.
So he has company.
You can't even just call him really a president. You probably call him a presidential monarch. And then just across the river, the Congo River, you're talking about Sassou Nguesso, who also changed the constitution. He can run for president for as long as he lives. And then you have another neighbor in East Africa there by the name V.O.A. Museveni. Not only did he, in fact, amend the constitution back in 2005 to change the term limits, they also successfully actually amended the constitution last year in December to remove the age limit, the age cap, so that he too now, he feels comfortable enough that in fact he might as well die in office.
So looking at how some of these things are going, you're looking at West Africa where it used to be so destabilized. Now they seem to be putting their houses in order with electing their president legitimately through the ballot boxes. East Africa, that used to be a bastion of stability and all that, seem not to be doing the same. What is the problem there?
When you talk about East Africa used to be a bastion of stability, it really depends what you mean by stability. The question is stability and peace, are those in fact conditions that you call stability because of what they call the absence of war, the absence of violence? Or is it in fact the presence of something else, something that someone might characterize as social economic justice for all of us? You don't have those conditions in East Africa. In fact, you never had those conditions in East Africa. I think that rightly so, West Africa is taking the lead because guess what? It was March 6, 1957, when Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the Osajefo, the Redeemer, the kid from Crawford, he essentially led a charge that helped Ghana, or that country at that time, the Gold Coast, to regain her political independence. And I remember some of the key words he used at that time. He said, the independence of Ghana would be meaningless unless it is linked to the total liberation of the African continent. Right. And mind you, Peter, you should be very proud of that, especially being Ghanaian, because that man did not simply talk the talk. He actually walked the talk by providing tools, by providing support to those other African, states that were still under colonialism, to such an extent that 1994, when Nelson Mandela, the Madiba, became the president of South Africa, that was the end of the political dream that had actually been initiated, or the vision that had been initiated by that kid from Crawford, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. So West Africa is on the right track.
So, Shaka, let's talk briefly about what's on Straight Talk Africa tomorrow.
Tomorrow we are actually going to look at U.S.-Africa foreign policy. And among the guests that we are having is Madam Stephanie Sullivan, who happened to be on the trip of the most recent Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. She was on the trip. And so she's going to be in the studio to share with us some of the experiences and whether or not, in fact, there is such a thing as U.S.-Africa foreign policy. Because there are some people, in fact, if it is there, such a policy probably, in their view, not mine, Peter, they would call it benign neglect, just like during the Nixon era in the early 70s. So we look forward to that, and of course we'll have also another guest who you probably know about, Malik Shaka. Malik Shaka is a brother, an African-American who worked at the U.S. Congress as a congressional professional staffer for 7 years. He was, in fact, among others, I remember working for the late Congressman Donald Payne of New Jersey.
Right.
And then he went to the Millennium Challenge Corporation. He was the director there. He just retired. So he has a lot of experiences, really, to share. I'm looking forward to tomorrow's, tomorrow's show.
Somebody was asking me, will the show address the controversy surrounding President Trump's, speech or talk about Africa and the firing of Tillerson, which some people say was a slight, since Tillerson was in Africa to smoothing relations following the controversy that was reported in all, media here in the U.S.
I think that person may probably be a little bit late, because the last time I checked, we did in fact address that issue, or those two issues that you just raised last week.
Right.
With Dr. Sally Buka, a gentleman who knows Africa just as much as anybody. And there was also a lady, Fatimata, a lady from Sierra Leone, who happens to be an attorney, and by the way, is trying to run for the Maryland National Assembly. So she's trying to become a delegate, in fact,
right,
in one of the congressional districts in Maryland, and she was remarkably articulate. But we'll talk about a lot of other things. We'll talk about, for example, whether in fact, whether in fact that was very important in terms of, those unkind, and complimentary words to Africa. But the Africans themselves, the African leadership itself, has actually said that is water under the bridge, because apparently, if you hadn't heard, President Trump personally wrote a letter that would seem to be an apology of sorts, that frankly I think seemed to satisfy majority of African leaders. So I don't think that we'll pretty much go that again. And when you talk about the manner in which he was fired, again, we don't really know even why he was fired.
Right.
But I was telling somebody that you have to give President Donald Trump credit, sincerely, for patience and what have you. Because this man, Rex Tillerson himself, I remember one time he was being quoted, actually, as talking about his boss as someone, for example, that, if I really heard correctly, in two phrases that you wouldn't really feel comfortable mentioning on air.
Right.
And yet, he was never fired. He was never fired. So I think that, Trump deserves a lot of credit for patience.
Thank you all for joining us here for Shaka Extra Time, a show only on Facebook where Shaka answers your questions. See you all next week. Bye for now.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.